Hello everybody, it's Wyron here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, Quick Match gameplay. This time around, we are playing as the Wood Elves against the Dwarves, kind of continuing this Wood Elf kick. Hopefully, I won't be boring you guys with how much Wood Elf play you're seeing. I'm hoping to definitely show off some other gameplay as well, as I slowly but surely just play through all the play around with the different factions. But obviously, I've always been a bit of a Wood Elf nut, so it's been just a lot of fun playing him. And nonetheless, here going against the Dwarves, of course, as many of you know, it's not the greatest of matchups with the Wood Elves. They definitely tend to get massacred by the dwarf shooting. The Way Watchers can do a bit of work. Obviously, Starfire Shafts actually got a bit of a buff against the dwarves because they no longer do magical damage, which means that now they do their full damage against the dwarves when they're going in. But otherwise, the Elves have always had a bit of a rough time. So in this time around, rather than doing the more conventional sort of Eternal Guard build with some Wildwood Rangers relying on the shields and then perhaps some Wild Riders and Way Watchers to peck away at my opponent's troops, I decided to go with a very, very rush-heavy build that's centered around War Dancers. So for my Lord, I did decide to bring Durthu. Durthu is not bringing any spells, as you can see. Now, Durthu, of course, does magic damage, which is less than ideal against Dwarves, but he still has monstrous HP pool. He does cause Fear Terror. He's got combined 35% resistance to missile damage because he has physical resist as well as missile resist, and on top of that 100 armor. And it's worth mentioning that while Durthu might not seem great against the dwarves who can bring so much AP fire, the dwarves will often not bother with armor piercing missiles against the elves because they are trying to match you for range, so they'll try to bring in Quarrelers or Rangers are fairly popular in those sorts of units. Of course, Durthu does have the Lamentation of Despair, which is a great little armor-piercing magic missile attack, and he does have the Sword of Dathan, and this is really the key reason I'm bringing him here. The 30 armor debuff is something I'm hoping to combo in a manner that will allow my War Dancers to smush my opponent's troops in seconds. As you can see, I did bring a Spellslinger of Shadows here, nothing fancy, she's on foot. She does have a huge selection of spells though. In retrospect, I made a huge error here. I brought Occam's Mind Razor, which is a fairly expensive spell, but kind of useless against the dwarves. The plus 40% overall weapon damage is going to be mitigated by the fact that they have 25% magic resistance. So in general, you're better off not bothering with this. And this was something I was kind of hoping to test, but I didn't quite think through. Alongside that, I did bring the Withering, and this is really, once again, the main reason I'm bringing the Spellslinger, bringing that 30 armor debuff, which stacked on top of Durthu's Sword of Death would be minus 60 armor. I also did the Penumbral Pendulum to damage any backlines, and then the Enfeebling Foe to hopefully isolate enemy troops, make them much easier to kill off. My front line is composed, well, first we have a unit of Eternal Guard. These early guys are literally cannon fodder. They're there to bait out my opponent's first shots, and kind of soak up damage, soak up satchel charges, that sort of stuff, and essentially die, so that my War Dancers can make it in. You can see I have 4 units of War Dancers here. Normally these guys are not ideal against Dwarves, simply because their weapon strength is kind of low. It's 36 plus 8 bonus against infantry, but it's not armor piercing, so against the Dwarves that's really not great. But they do have great melee attack. They will hit Dwarf infantry very, very consistently, and I'm hoping that with the debuffs, these guys will be able to shred the Dwarf troops and then collapse on the backline very quickly. Second line, we do have Wildwood Rangers. These guys are there to crack some of the tougher nut units with their monstrous melee attack and 42 armor-piercing weapon strength. They're not dedicated against infantry like some of the War Dancers or like some of the High Elf and Dark Elf infantry, but nonetheless, these guys are very, very potent. Finally, 2 units of Glade Guard with Starfire Shafts, kind of rounding things out, ready to apply some pressure to key enemy troops, and a unit of Sisters of the Thorn. And these guys did get nerfed a little bit. They now cost a little more, but they do have 2 charges of Curse of Anorar, which after it's buffed to affect melee attack is a very, very potent spell, and then Shield of Thorns, which is a great little debuff and buff to your troops. And buffing weapon strength is not bad, especially on War Dancers who have mostly weapons damage and not armor and not a lot of it is armor piercing. So as you can see, for my opponent, he decided to go with a very shooting heavy build. He is trying to screen away my Sisters of the Thorn here with some Bugman's Rangers. For his Lord, he decided to go very cheap. He brought a simple Dwarf Lord. Not always the worst of choices. Generally, I prefer to bring something like a Rune Lord or Grumbrindle or Belagar. Honestly, I think most of the named Dwarf Lords are really, really good, but the Dwarf Lord can work and he's dirt cheap. He also does have the Banner of the Lost Holds, I do believe, which provides a bonus to melee attack and weapon damage to nearby troops. So definitely he'll be very tanky, very tough for me to kill, and could be a bit of a nuisance in just locking down my troops. My opponent's front line is dirt cheap. It's a bunch of Dwarf Warriors. These guys will trade pretty favorably with the Eternal Guard normally, and even the Warriors of Dragonfire Pass, of course, are very solid. They have fire damage, so if I brought Dryads for some ungodly reason, they'd be really good there. And they have a bonus against infantry. They've got just really solid stats overall. They're very, very potent. So Obviously, nonetheless, my opponent's front line is cheap. They are susceptible to psychology, and we'll see how the things work out, because my opponent's main investment has been his backline. He does have a unit of miners with blasting charges here, another unit of miners back there, 2 units of slayers, and it's worth noting that slayers are actually really potent against wood elf infantry just because they're so squishy, so they can kind of serve almost a dual purpose. They can definitely massacre units like Sisters of the Thorn if they get into melee, or slaughter units like Wild Riders. But if your opponent pushes into melee, they can also jump in on War Dancers or Wildwood Rangers or any of those units and trade pretty effectively. They actually have really high HP, as you can see, at 6,480. That's a lot for only 60 models. My opponent does have 3 units of Quarrelers here, as well as the Goblobber providing the core of his shooting contingent, Ulthar's Raiders to apply some armor-piercing damage, and then 2 units of Bugman's Rangers, backed by a Thane with Tormentor Sword and Foe Seeker on either flank, so ready to kind of shut me down, prevent my troops from escaping, and just make himself a general nuisance. What I'm doing over here is poking forward with my Sisters of the Thorn, trying to apply some damage to the Slayers. I didn't realize the Bugman's Rangers were here. You can see my opponent's Catapult already firing away, chipping away at my Eternal Guard, which has already lost 9 models. Over here, I do get a little cheeky, and I fire some shots into the Slayers, picking off a model and doing a bit of damage with the Javelins. But as you can see, my opponent responds immediately with his Quarrelers, as well as with the Bugman's Rangers, who I didn't see until they opened fire. Bugman's Rangers is definitely not a pushover unit. I'm not the biggest fan just because they're so expensive for regen, and they tend to bleed models, but they can do a lot of work. Over here you can see the Wildwood Rangers now do take some fire. My Starfire shafts are firing off. One of the problems is that if you don't turn off auto fire, obviously your troops will just automatically fire, and with the Wood Elves especially, where their troops don't need to stop to shoot, that tends to happen. I do shift fire to the miners with blasting charges though, because they are unshielded, and the blasting charge is actually pretty potent against Wood Elves. You can see the Eternal Guard here is going to eat a whole volley to the face, which is going to be really unfortunate. The blasting charge is going in on these guys, and they're just going to get smushed. But it is what it is. Starfire shafts raining down from the heavens, and the War Dancers are in the fight now against the Dwarf Warriors. Despite getting shot up pretty badly by the missiles, with the Wildwood Rangers in there, they will collapse this line very quickly. And as you can see, the Wildwood Rangers are rather healthy. I do pop my Sword of Death, debuffing these troops, hit these Warriors with Dragonfire Pass with Enfeebling Foe, and these guys are going to start collapsing incredibly quickly. You can see their HP just tanking as they're being taken to town by the Wildwood Rangers and War Dancers. This is followed, of course, by Withering, debuffing enemy armor even more, and you can see the Ulthar's Raiders here just falling apart. Eternal Guard pushing forward. Miners are basically gone, and on every flank, my line is really kind of pushing through and collapsing my opponent's troops. War Dancers just push through, slaughtering these Warriors with Dragonfire Pass as they try to rout away, as the Wild Rangers push in against the Stain. Unfortunately, this is clumping me up and allowing the enemy artillery to do a lot of damage, and I forget to shut the enemy artillery down, so this was a huge mistake on my part. Over here, I'm using the Sisters of the Thorn as a simple cavalry unit, shutting down the Bugman's Rangers and kind of damaging them as much as I can. Sisters of the Thorn aren't great melee combatants, but they're also not terrible, so you can see they're definitely getting some kills, especially with the help of the War Dancers in there. Unfortunately, although I'm shutting down the Ulthar's Raiders, hitting everything here with Curse of Honorire, I'm not shutting down the Goblobber, which keeps firing away, slaughtering this pocket of Wildwood Rangers, and this was a huge mistake on my part, and something I didn't realize at the time. Over here, I'm peppering down the Slayers with the Starfire shafts, which are practically ignored at this point. My opponent is so focused on just trying to hold his front line together, which really isn't happening. The War Dancers just massacring their way through the Ulthar's Raiders, and you can see just the Wild Rangers collapsing in. Shield of Thorns going down, of course. The Sister of the Thorn provide you with 2 fairly expensive spells for free, and that's definitely very nice. You can see Durthu taking a bit of a beating from the Slayers, but he still does have that 100 armor and 20% physical resist, so he's not the biggest of pushovers against units like Slayers and Thanes and all those sorts of troops. Finally, my War Dancers do get on top of the Goblobber, and although it does get a few last shots off, you can see they are hacking and slashing through this Dwarven crew, really shutting him down for good. The poor Dwarves just getting slaughtered there in the pits, and obviously the Dwarf crews are simply not able to do much of anything here, especially with Durthu there. Everything's going to start fear and terror routing, which is only really going to leave the Slayers. War Dancers will do fairly well against Slayers. You can see they're already up in the hundreds for the kills. My opponent's troops, when they rout, obviously can't really escape very far in most cases, just because my troops are faster. You can see the miners with blasting charges here getting run down by the Sisters of Thorn, who have only lost 4 models, and they're up to 41 kills. Their spells have been super useful. You can see the Slayers here being slaughtered as I pop another Sword of Death and another Withering, debuffing everything in the pits here, and just causing an absolute kind of charnel house to happen here. And of course the Thanes would hold for a little while longer. The Slayers are basically gone to a man, and at this point my opponent's army does shatter. So, looking at the composition here, I definitely think my opponent went a little bit greedy on the shooting, either overestimating the ability of Dwarven shooting, or more likely underestimating just how much melee you need to effectively protect a backline against the Wood Elves. But nonetheless, the strategy kind of worked out. Definitely things could have gone a little worse had my opponent had more satchel charges. More blasting charges would have probably meant a bigger dent in my War Dancers and my Wildwood Rangers. Slightly better focus fire could have ensured that my opponent picked off, say, an entire unit of Wildwood Rangers before I managed to reach the fight, and that would have definitely been a major issue for me. Nonetheless, I think this build actually worked rather well. The War Dancers, because of their massive melee attack against and decent melee defense, they actually trade rather well against the Dwarves, especially when the Dwarves are so horribly debuffed. Because the Dwarven infantry, without their armor, and with their melee defense not being that good enough to really deny the War Dancers 52 combined melee attack with their bonuses. It really means they just kind of get annihilated. The War Dancers are just hitting them consistently, and they're just chewing their way through them. And once that front line collapses, then any back line is not long for this world. Wildwood Rangers definitely contributing rather well. You can see the War Dancers doing a great job, actually better than all but one of the Wildwood Rangers for most part, and some of them even outperformed them. So with those debuffs, with that quick gap closing, they just proved absolutely brutal. Durthu just tanking and holding for eternity. Slayers, despite being anti-large, obviously don't have the greatest armor piercing. They have pretty high armor piercing, just because their weapons range is so monstrous. But I do believe it's only a third. I do believe only about a third of their damage is armor piercing. So against Durthu, he's definitely able to kind of hold his own and just endure against the Slayers for a long time. And with the Sword of Daith going down, chipping away at their HP, using the Withering and Enfeebling Foe to cripple key enemy targets, the Warriors of Dragonfire Pass, who could have been a major issue for me, at least a stumbling block, collapsed almost immediately thanks to Enfeebling Foe and the Withering hitting them. The key mistake I made that game was allowing the Goblobber to keep firing unimpeded long after I had collapsed my opponent's backline. I'd slaughtered his front line, his troops were all fleeing. I could have easily gotten a unit of War Dancers on top of the Goblobber, and instead I allowed it to keep firing, which resulted in one of my units of Wild Rangers, I do believe this unit, losing a massive amount of models. And that's simply a player error. There's nothing else to say there. I should have shut it down as quickly as possible, and instead I didn't. You can see the rest of my opponent's shooting got very little done. They just got slaughtered in a matter of really seconds. And yeah, if I were to critique my opponent's build, I would definitely say perhaps bring more normal infantry, perhaps drop the Bugman's Rangers, perhaps even downgrade the Quarrelers and Bugman's Rangers to downgrade the Quarrelers to Rangers, and switch the Bugman's Rangers out for actual combat units. Bring Longbeards, perhaps, for the psychological immunity, because of course Dwarf Warriors are not immune to psychology, so with Durthu plowing through them, that will start terror routing. So I definitely think there were some slight differences my opponent could have made with his build while staying competitive against other builds. I definitely a bigger front line would have helped, but nonetheless I'm not sure it would have been enough, because War Dancers, even against Longbeards with such massive debuffs hitting the Longbeards, would be able to just chew through them rather effectively. So nonetheless, good game to my opponent John Bird here. I think this is a pretty cool strategy. You could obviously try out with the Wood Elves. It's just relying on debuffs to melt enemy troops. And yeah, I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions, or anything like that, be sure to post them down in the comments, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.